Scientists in the 1950s already knew carbon dioxide acted like a blanket, trapping heat in our atmosphere. Some oil company researchers even confirmed, in private reports decades ago, the potential for fossil fuels to cause global warming. Imagine a world where these early warnings were heeded, a world where the global temperature hadn't climbed so rapidly. In that world, a single superstorm wouldn't now be capable of inflicting over $100 billion in damage. Millions of acres, an area larger than entire countries, wouldn't be engulfed each year by historically unprecedented wildfires, and the projection that hundreds of millions of people might be forced from their homes by the middle of this century due to climate impacts might just be a forgotten nightmare. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about exploring a different path, a history that could have been, by looking at the global challenges that might have been sidestepped, or at least dramatically softened, if the trajectory of carbon emissions had been altered way back when. Number 9. The silent disappearance of mountain water towers. Mountain glaciers, those majestic rivers of ice, are often called the world's water towers. They store vast amounts of fresh water, releasing it slowly during warmer, drier months, feeding rivers that sustain agriculture and provide drinking water for billions of people. Think of the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, the Rockies. These aren't just pretty postcard scenes. They are critical components of the global water cycle. Since the mid-20th century, however, these frozen reservoirs had been shrinking at an alarming rate. Globally, glaciers lost an average of over 260 billion metric tons of ice per year between 2000 and 2019. Some smaller glaciers have already vanished entirely. The U.S. Geological Survey reports that Glacier National Park in Montana, which had around 150 glaciers in 1850, now has fewer than 26, and many of those are greatly reduced in size. This isn't just about losing scenic wonders. The meltwater from Himalayan glaciers, for instance, feeds major rivers like the Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra, which are lifelines for over 1 billion people in South Asia. As these glaciers shrink, the initial increased meltwater can cause temporary boosts in river flow, sometimes leading to flooding. But as the ice volume dwindles, the long-term prospect is a significant reduction in this vital water source, especially during dry seasons when it's needed most. This has profound implications for food production, hydropower generation, and urban water supplies. Now picture a scenario where, in the 1950s, the world began a concerted effort to limit the emission of greenhouse gases. Physicist Gilbert Plas, in 1956, published scientific papers highlighting the warming effect of increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. If policies had followed that understanding, promoting energy efficiency and investing in renewable energy sources much earlier, the rise in global temperatures could have been substantially curtailed. Climate models indicate that if atmospheric CO2 levels had been stabilized, say below 350 parts per million, they are now over 420 ppm, the rate of glacial melt would have been far slower. Glaciers would still have experienced natural fluctuations, but the accelerated human-induced retreat observed in recent decades could have been largely avoided. The water towers would have remained much more robust. Communities downstream, from Peruvian farmers to Indian cities, would face a more predictable and secure water future. The seasonal pulse of meltwater, crucial for irrigation in dry periods, would have continued its age-old rhythm rather than threatening to diminish to a trickle within generations. The geotensions that can arise from transboundary water disputes over shrinking resources might also have been lessened. The silent, creeping crisis of disappearing glaciers, a crisis that builds slowly but has immense consequences, could have remained a minor concern rather than the growing global challenge it is today. The iconic snows of Kilimanjaro, which have shrunk by over 80% since the early 20th century, might still be a vast, shimmering ice cap. Number 8. The Arctic's lost ice and drowned coastlines. The Arctic is often described as Earth's refrigerator, but it's been warming at least twice. Some studies say 3 or even 4 times as fast as the global average. This phenomenon is known as Arctic amplification. One of the most visible signs of this rapid warming is the dramatic decline in Arctic sea ice. Each summer, the area covered by sea ice shrinks, reaching its minimum in September. Since satellite records began in 1979, the September Arctic sea ice extent has decreased by about 13% per decade. Not only is the extent shrinking, but the ice is also becoming younger and thinner, making it more vulnerable to further melting. The loss of summer sea ice has profound consequences. Bright white ice reflects sunlight back into space. Darker open ocean absorbs it, leading to further warming, a feedback loop. This warming affects Arctic ecosystems, from polar bears who rely on sea ice for hunting seals, to walruses and other marine life. Beyond the Arctic, the changes have global ramifications. The warming Arctic is thought to influence weather patterns in the mid-latitudes, potentially contributing to more persistent and extreme weather events in North America, Europe, and Asia. Another major concern is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. This colossal body of ice holds enough water to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters, 23 feet, if it were to melt entirely. While a complete melt would take centuries or millennia, it is already contributing significantly to sea level rise. Between 1992 and 2018, Greenland lost an estimated 3.8 trillion tons of ice, contributing about 10.6 millimeters to global sea level rise. Coastal communities around the world, from Miami to Bangladesh to small island nations in the Pacific, are already experiencing the effects of rising seas, including more frequent sunny day flooding, increased coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies. Had the world embarked on a path of climate action in the 1950s, the Arctic we see today would likely be a very different place. Charles David Keeling began his continuous measurements of atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, in 1958, providing clear evidence of rising concentrations. If this data, coupled with the earlier understanding of CO2's warming properties, had spurred global efforts to transition away from fossil fuels, the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations would have been far smaller. With significantly less human-caused warming, Arctic amplification would have been greatly reduced. The decline in summer sea ice extent would have been much less severe. Multi-year ice, the thick, resilient ice that survives multiple melt seasons, would likely still dominate much of the Arctic Ocean rather than the younger, thinner ice seen today. The Greenland ice sheet would be losing mass at a much slower, perhaps near natural rate. Consequently, its contribution to global sea level rise would be minimal compared to current observations. Coastal communities worldwide would be facing a far less urgent threat from rising oceans. The hundreds of billions of dollars currently being projected for adapting coastal infrastructure might not be necessary on such a grand scale. The unique Arctic ecosystems would be under less stress, and the traditional ways of life of indigenous Arctic peoples, which are deeply intertwined with the ice, would be more secure. The destabilization of global weather patterns linked to Arctic warming might also be less pronounced. The refrigerator would still be running effectively, helping to keep the global climate system more stable. Number 7. The invisible spread of tropical diseases northward. Diseases that were once largely confined to tropical and subtropical regions have been appearing in areas previously considered too cool for them to thrive. Think of dengue fever, whitetuck virus, chikungunya, West Nile virus, and Lyme disease. These are often vector-borne diseases meaning they are transmitted by insects, like mosquitoes and ticks. The geographic range and activity of these vectors are highly sensitive to climatic conditions, particularly temperature and rainfall patterns. As global temperatures have risen, many regions have become more hospitable to these disease carriers. Warmer temperatures can accelerate the life cycle of mosquitoes, meaning they reproduce more quickly. Warmer conditions also speed up the replication rate of viruses within mosquitoes, making them infectious sooner. Changes in rainfall can also play a role. Increased rainfall can create more breeding sites for mosquitoes, while drought can drive humans and mosquitoes to share limited water sources, increasing contact. For example, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a primary vector for dengue, Zika, and chikungunya, has expanded its range. Dengue fever, which was prevalent in only a handful of countries before 1970, is now endemic in over 100 countries, with the World Health Organization estimating hundreds of millions of infections annually. Lyme disease, transmitted by ticks, has seen its incidence increase and its geographic range expand northward in North America and Europe, a trend linked to milder winters and longer, warmer summers that favor tick survival and activity. The economic burden of these diseases is substantial, including healthcare costs, lost productivity, and tourism impacts. If the 1950s had marked the beginning of a global push to control greenhouse gas emissions, the world's climate would be considerably cooler today. The average global temperature has risen by more than 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, since the pre-industrial era, with most of that warming occurring since the mid-20th century. Had early action been taken, this warming could have been limited to a fraction of a degree. In such a scenario, the expansion of the habitat suitable for disease vectors like mosquitoes and ticks would have been significantly curtailed. The Aedes mosquito might still be largely confined to its historical tropical ranges. Outbreaks of dengue or jasuk in temperate regions would be rare, isolated incidents rather than emerging public health threats. The northward creep of Lyme disease might have been much slower, or not occurred to the extent observed. Public health systems in many countries would not be facing the additional strain of combating these new diseases on top of existing health challenges. The resources spent on surveillance, vector control, and treating climate-sensitive diseases could have been allocated elsewhere. The subtle but pervasive anxiety in communities newly at risk from these illnesses would be absent. While disease patterns are complex and influenced by many factors, including travel and trade, the significant amplifying effect of a rapidly warming climate on vector-borne diseases could have been largely muted. People in many parts of Europe and North America wouldn't be checking for ticks with the same frequency, and the buzz of a mosquito might not carry the same undercurrent of worry about exotic fevers. Number 6. The food price spikes that shook nations. Global food security is a delicate balance, influenced by weather, crop yields, energy prices, and global markets. In recent decades, the world has experienced several sharp spikes in food prices, such as those in 2007 to 2008 and 2010 to 2011, which led to widespread hardship and, in some cases, social unrest. While multiple factors contribute to such crises, increasingly extreme and unpredictable weather patterns linked to climate change play a significant role. Droughts in major grain-producing regions like Australia, Russia, and the United States have, at various times, severely impacted global supplies of wheat, corn, and rice. For instance, the 2010 Russian heat wave and drought led to devastating wildfires and a ban on wheat exports, contributing to a surge in global grain prices. Similarly, prolonged droughts in the U.S. Midwest have affected corn and soybean yields, with knock-on effects on livestock feed and food prices. Conversely, extreme rainfall and flooding can also destroy crops and disrupt supply chains. Rising temperatures themselves can directly impact crop physiology, reducing yields for staple crops like maize, wheat, and rice in many regions, especially in tropical and subtropical areas where many food-insecure populations live. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPC, has reported that climate change has already negatively affected food security globally. These impacts are not felt equally. Vulnerable populations in low-income countries who spend a larger proportion of their income on food are often hit hardest by price volatility and supply shortages. Imagine a world where the warnings from scientists in the 1950s about the heat-trapping nature of CO2 had led to proactive global energy policies. If humanity had begun transitioning to cleaner energy sources then, the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would be substantially lower. The global average temperature rise would be significantly less than the 1 degree Celsius plus we've experienced. In this alternate timeline, agricultural systems would be operating in a more stable and predictable climate. The frequency and intensity of extreme heat waves, droughts, and floods that have plagued key breadbasket regions would likely be much reduced. For example, the severity of the Australian Millennium Drought, roughly 1997 to 2009, or the intensity of the 2012 U.S. drought might have been lessened, leading to more stable crop yields. Farmers would face fewer climate-related shocks, making food production more reliable. Global food reserves would likely be more robust and markets less prone to the kind of volatility that triggers rapid price increases. The ripple effects on consumers, particularly the poorest, would be diminished. Countries would be less likely to resort to export bans in response to climate-driven harvest failures, which can exacerbate global price spikes, while other factors like population growth and dietary shifts would still influence food demand. The supply side would be far more resilient. The international community would not have had to grapple as intensely with food crises that were, in part, amplified by a rapidly changing climate. The hungry season in many vulnerable regions might not have been stretched longer or made harsher by climate-related crop failures. Number 5. The millions forced to flee their homes without a war. The term climate refugee is not yet formally recognized in international law, but the phenomenon of people being displaced by the impacts of climate change is a growing reality. Slow onset. Events like sea level rise, desertification, and dwindling water resources, as well as rapid onset disasters like floods, storms, and wildfires, are increasingly forcing people to leave their homes and communities. The World Bank estimated in its 2021 Groundswell report that, without concrete climate and development action, climate change could internally displace over 216 million people across 6 world regions by 2050. These are people not fleeing conflict or persecution in the traditional sense, but rather environments that are becoming unlivable. Small island developing states like Kiribati, Tuvalu in the Maldives face existential threats from rising sea levels, which contaminate freshwater sources and erode land. In the Sahel region of Africa, desertification and land degradation, exacerbated by changing rainfall patterns and rising temperatures, are undermining agricultural livelihoods and fueling migration. In Bangladesh, millions living in low-lying coastal areas are vulnerable to increasingly frequent and intense cyclones and tidal flooding. Even in wealthier nations, climate displacement is occurring. After Hurricane Katrina, in 2005, hundreds of thousands were displaced from New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, many permanently. Wildfires in California, Australia, and elsewhere have forced evacuations and left communities uninhabitable. This displacement often occurs within national borders, but cross-border movements are also happening and are projected to increase. Such movements can place strain on resources in receiving areas and have the potential to create social tensions. Consider if the knowledge available in the 1950s that CO2 emissions were warming the planet had translated into swift global action. If the world had embarked on a trajectory of low-carbon development, then the climatic changes driving much of this displacement would be far less severe. Sea level rise would be occurring at a much slower rate, giving low-lying coastal communities and island nations more time to adapt, or perhaps avoiding the need for widespread relocation altogether. The expansion of deserts and the degradation of arable land due to altered rainfall and temperature extremes would be less pronounced. The agricultural livelihoods that sustain hundreds of millions would be more secure. The intensity of tropical cyclones, fueled by warmer ocean waters, might not have increased to the levels observed. The number and scale of climate-related disasters forcing evacuations would likely be lower. In this scenario, the projected figures of tens or hundreds of millions of climate migrants might never have materialized as such a daunting forecast. Communities would be more resilient, rooted in places their families have lived for generations. The immense human suffering associated with forced displacement, loss of home, livelihood, culture, and community ties would be significantly reduced. Governments and international organizations would not be grappling with the immense challenge of how to manage and support large populations uprooted by environmental change. The potential for climate-induced migration to exacerbate instability or conflict over resources would be diminished. The narrative would be one of adaptation to more modest environmental shifts, rather than a desperate flight from increasingly hostile environments. Number 4. The wildfires that ate continents. In recent years, the world has witnessed wildfires of unprecedented scale and intensity, often described as megafires or gigafires. Vast swaths of Australia, California, Siberia, the Amazon, and even parts of the Arctic and Mediterranean Europe have been consumed by flames. These aren't just bigger fires. They behave more erratically, spread faster, burn hotter, and are harder to control. In 2019 to 2020, Australia's Black Summer bushfires burned over 17 million hectares, 42 million acres, an area larger than many European countries, killing or displacing an estimated 3 billion animals. California has seen record-breaking fire seasons year after year, with millions of acres burned, thousands of homes destroyed, and hazardous smoke blanketing cities for weeks. In 2020, more than 4 million acres burned in California alone. These fires have devastating impacts: loss of human life and property, destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity, severe air pollution, affecting millions, and significant economic costs. Scientists point to a clear link between these increasingly extreme wildfires and climate change. Hotter temperatures dry out vegetation, creating more fuel for fires. Longer and more intense heat waves extend the fire season. Changes in precipitation patterns can also contribute to drier conditions. For example, research has shown that the increase in forest fire activity in the western United States since the 1980s is strongly correlated with warming temperatures and earlier spring snowmelt. The smoke from these massive fires can travel thousands of miles, affecting air quality and health far from the fire fronts. Now, let's rewind to the 1950s. Imagine a world that took the early scientific understanding of CO2's warming potential seriously. If policies had been implemented then to curb fossil fuel emissions and promote sustainable land management practices, the global temperature increase we've seen would be far less. The extreme heat and drought conditions that prime landscapes for megafires would be less frequent and less severe. Forest ecosystems would be more resilient, less stressed by chronic heat and water scarcity. The length of fire seasons might not have extended so dramatically. While wildfires are a natural part of many ecosystems, their scale and ferocity would likely have remained within historical norms, rather than escalating to the catastrophic levels witnessed recently. The fire weather. a combination of hot, dry, and windy conditions that drives extreme fire behavior would occur less often. Communities living in fire-prone regions would face a more manageable risk. The billions of dollars spent annually on fire suppression and recovery could be significantly lower. The tragic loss of life and the immense ecological damage, such as the near extinction of certain species in fire-ravaged areas, could have been largely avoided. Air quality in regions downwind of major fire zones would be cleaner, reducing respiratory illnesses and other health problems associated with smoke inhalation. The iconic landscapes of California's forests, Australia's bush, and the Mediterranean maquis would be less scarred by these supercharged blazes. Terror of waking up to an orange sky and ash-filled air would be a much rarer experience for millions. Number 3. When California, and many other places, almost ran out of water. Water scarcity is becoming an increasingly pressing issue in many parts of the world, and California serves as a stark example. The state home to nearly 40 million people and a massive agricultural industry that feeds much of the U.S. has experienced increasingly frequent and severe droughts in the 21st century. The drought from 2012 to 2016 was one of the most intense in its recorded history, leading to mandatory water restrictions, devastating impacts on agriculture, depleted reservoirs, and increased transmoded pumping, which in turn caused land subsidence in some areas. Other regions globally face similar or even more dire situations. Cape Town, South Africa, narrowly averted Day Zero in 2018. The day when city taps would have been turned off through drastic water conservation measures. Parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Australia, and South Asia are also grappling with chronic water stress where demand outstrips renewable supplies. This scarcity is driven by a combination of factors including population growth, increased demand from agriculture and industry, and inefficient water management. However, climate change is a significant exacerbating factor. Rising temperatures increase evaporation from soil and reservoirs and can reduce snowpack, a vital source of fresh water for many regions. Changes in precipitation patterns can lead to less reliable rainfall or more intense but less frequent rain events, making it harder to capture and store water. Colorado River Basin in the U.S., which supplies water to 40 million people and irrigates millions of acres, has been in a state of prolonged drought, with reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell shrinking to record low levels, a situation scientists say is significantly worsened by climate change. If the world had started to seriously address CO2 emissions in the 1950s, the trajectory of global warming would be very different. The additional heat stress on water systems would be substantially less. For California, a milder warming trend would likely mean a more robust Sierra Nevada snowpack, which historically provides about a third of the state's water supply. The snow would melt more gradually, replenishing reservoirs and rivers more reliably through the dry summer months. The intensity and duration of droughts might still occur due to natural variability, but they would be less amplified by the persistent heat and altered precipitation patterns linked to a rapidly warming climate. The desperate measures seen in California, like farmers fallowing fields, communities trucking in water, and strict urban rationing, might have been less frequent or less severe. Similarly, regions like Cape Town might not have faced such a knife-edge Day Zero scenario. The pressures on major river basins like the Colorado would be eased, reducing the likelihood of politically fraught disputes over dwindling water allocations. Investment in water infrastructure and conservation would still be necessary, but it would be taking place in a more stable climatic context, rather than a race against escalating scarcity. The billions of dollars in economic losses attributed to climate-amplified droughts could have been reduced. Groundwater aquifers, which are being depleted at alarming rates in many parts of the world as a buffer against surface water shortages, would be under less strain. The fundamental human need for water would be more secure for millions, if not billions, of people. Number 2. The age of superstorms that cost trillions. Hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones, different names for the same powerful rotating storm systems, have always been a destructive force of nature. However, there is growing scientific evidence that climate change is making these storms more dangerous. While it's complex to attribute any single storm solely to climate change, the trends are concerning warmer ocean waters provide more energy for storms to intensify. A warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, leading to heavier rainfall and increased flooding when these storms make landfall. Sea level rise. Another consequence of climate change exacerbates coastal flooding from storm surges. We've seen a series of incredibly destructive and costly storms in recent decades. Hurricane Katrina. 2005 caused an estimated $125 billion in damage in the U.S. Hurricane Harvey. 2017 dumped unprecedented rainfall on Houston, also exceeding $125 billion in costs. Hurricane Maria. 2017 devastated Puerto Rico, leading to thousands of deaths and prolonged power outages. Typhoon Haiyan. 2013 in the Philippines was one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded to make landfall. The economic toll of these superstorms runs into the hundreds of billions, sometimes trillions, of dollars globally over time, not to mention the immense human suffering, loss of life, and displacement. Rebuilding communities can take years, even decades, and some places never fully recover. Insurance markets are also feeling the strain, with premiums rising and availability shrinking in high-risk coastal areas. Imagine a different 20th and 21st century, one where the early warnings about CO2 from scientists like Gilbert Plass in the 1950s, or even earlier work by Svazant Arrhenius in the 1890s, had been heeded. If humanity had embarked on a path to limit greenhouse gas emissions from the mid-20th century onwards, the oceans would be significantly cooler today, and sea levels would not have risen as much. In this alternate reality, tropical storms would still form, but the scientific consensus suggests they would be less likely to rapidly intensify into the superstorm category. The amount of rainfall associated with them might be closer to historical norms rather than the record-shattering deluges seen with storms like Harvey. Storm surges would be less destructive because they would be launching from a lower baseline sea level. The devastation wrought by Katrina, Maria, Harvey, Haiyan, and many others could have been significantly less severe. Fewer lives might have been lost, fewer communities shattered. The economic costs, which divert vast resources from other societal needs, would be substantially lower. The immense effort and expense poured into coastal defenses and rebuilding might be on a more manageable scale. Islands and coastal regions would still face storm risks, but not the amplified threat supercharged by a warmer world. The narrative around hurricane season might be one of caution and preparedness for historically typical storms, rather than an annual dread of potentially unprecedented catastrophic events. The new normal of increasingly powerful and damaging storms simply wouldn't be the norm. Number 1. The Great Barrier Reef's near-death experience. The Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland, Australia, is the world's largest coral reef system, composed of over 2,900 individual reefs and 900 islands stretching for over 2,300 kilometers, 1,400 miles. It's so vast it can be seen from outer space and is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, teeming with an extraordinary diversity of marine life. However, this iconic ecosystem has suffered multiple mass coral bleaching events in recent years, primarily in 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022. Coral bleaching occurs when corals, under stress from excessively warm water temperatures, expel the symbiotic algae, zooxanthellae, living in their tissues, causing them to turn white. If the warm water persists, the corals can die. Primary driver of these marine heat waves is the rise in global ocean temperatures due to increased atmospheric greenhouse gases. The Great Barrier Reef has lost an estimated 50% of its coral cover since the 1990s. These bleaching events are not isolated to Australia. Coral reefs around the world, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, are experiencing similar devastation. Ocean acidification. Another direct consequence of increased CO2 in the atmosphere, as oceans absorb about a quarter of it, forming carbonic acid, further hinders coral growth and reef recovery by making it harder for corals and other marine organisms to build their calcium carbonate skeletons and shells. The loss of coral reefs has profound ecological consequences, as they provide habitat for about 25% of all marine species, and also significant economic impacts, affecting fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection for millions of people. Now, consider a scenario where the global community had acted decisively on climate change starting in the 1950s. By that time, the fundamental science of CO2's heat-trapping properties was understood. If a transition away from fossil fuels had begun then, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere today would be far lower than the current 420+ parts per million, perhaps remaining below the 350 ppm threshold that many scientists consider a safer limit for coral reefs. In such a world, the oceans would have absorbed far less heat and CO2. The marine heat waves that trigger mass bleaching events would be much rarer and less severe. The Great Barrier Reef and other coral ecosystems worldwide would likely be in a much healthier state. The widespread die-offs observed in recent decades might not have occurred, or would have been far less extensive. The vibrant colors and bustling bioturbidity of these underwater cities would still be largely intact. The waters would be less acidic, allowing corals to grow and build their structures more robustly. The livelihoods of millions of people dependent on reef-related tourism and fishing would be more secure. Future generations would be able to experience these magnificent natural wonders in their full glory, not as degraded remnants. Crucial coastal protection services that reefs provide, buffering shorelines from storms and erosion, would remain effective. The desperate scientific efforts now underway to find and breed heat-resistant corals, or to shade and cool reefs, might not be so urgently needed. The Great Barrier Reef could have remained a symbol of vibrant, natural health, rather than a prominent casualty of a rapidly changing climate.